Welcome, friends, again to the Indiana Bond Bank Bondcast. It's the podcast that brings you all the most interesting topics in public finance. And today is our third episode of our multi-episode series called Days of Our Cyber Lives, focusing on cybersecurity education, tips, and tricks for local units of government. And so thanks for joining us, whether you're watching on the video or listening to the audio-only version. Thanks for joining us. And remember, if you're listening here in October, here at the end of October, it is still National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and so you should feel good about yourself. Pat yourself on the back for boosting your awareness by listening to this podcast. I'm so excited to be joined again by my co-host, Indiana Treasurer of State, Kelly Mitchell, and our recurring guest, Cybersecurity Program Director at the Indiana Office of Technology and the Indiana Department of Homeland Security, Shatrice Mosley Romero.
Hello.
Hello again, guys. Good to see you.
Nice to see you too. Appreciate the backgrounds. I was thinking with Halloween coming up on the calendar, we should do something a little different this episode.
That sounds ghastly.
There are real life horror stories out there about local governments getting hacked.
Absolutely.
So let's curl up with our coffee and go around the virtual campfire and tell scary stories about cybersecurity breaches with local governments.
I've heard some. I don't know if I always know all the details of the story. I might just know the skeleton of it.
Maybe.
Oh, sorry.
There are most certainly some scary ones. I think a lot of times with local governments, we kind of assume, nobody's waking up, and saying, I'm going to attack a certain county or a certain local government, but that's not really how the attacks work, right? So I think what's scary about it is that it's very insidious. It's very, goes right into, a bunch of people knocking on doors, like our little trick-or-treaters. And if a door's open, then a cyber actor goes in and steals all your candy.
Shatrice is done for the day already. She's got her analogy.
Drop mic.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Kelly, we're on our own at this point. Well, let's give them pumpkin to talk about. And
yeah, someone please mute Mark.
Oh.
All right. So this one is really scary because it is something that is out of your control as a local government. It's a breach from a third party.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to third-party breaches, you can do everything right? If you're backing up your system, if you're asking the right questions, but if you're dealing with a vendor or you're dealing with, somebody that didn't do it on their end, you can be vulnerable too. So it is scary because you really, it's one of those things where we can do everything correctly, but all we're trying to aim for is not 100% protection. It's kind of like when you get on the road, like we talked about before, right? Or like taking candy, right? Like my kids, they may go take candy from places and all these people I don't even know. So you don't know everybody you're dealing with from a tech perspective, but it is still your job to ask the questions, to look over it, to, put precautions around it and just be as informed as possible when it comes to your technology and all those endpoints that we talked about a couple of episodes ago.
So Kelly, tell me more about what did you hear? Tell me the spookiness. Tell me the story. What happened?
It's a scary one. I saw in the news, literally between the last podcast and this one, that a major provider of software services to local governments across the country told customers that an unknown intruder hacked into its phone and IT system. This company has contracts with towns, schools, and even is the manager of statewide e-filing systems for courts. So one cybersecurity expert said he was concerned hackers may have obtained access to the passwords of customers stored on the company's network and could penetrate their systems.
Wow. So just like you were saying, you do everything right locally.
Mm-hmm.
But then you've got this third-party vendor.
Yeah. So it's, when that happens, what you can do is protect yourself as quickly as you find out, right? So, if you're in local government and you hear of a vendor that is similar, or is the vendor, in a very scary situation like that, you hear, hopefully that vendor contacted all their customers and let them know before the news media got a hold of it. That does not, unfortunately, always happen. A lot of times people go the quiet route and somebody doesn't feel that that's right and somebody leaks it to the press. And that's a whole other conversation. But I think as soon as you know that, contact the vendor, ask questions, and because it is our responsibility working for government, right, that we're protecting taxpayers' information, that we're protecting citizens' information. So it's one of those things where, it is absolutely fair for us to demand that we know what's happening, we know when it happens, and how do we start protecting ourselves and closing those gaps, whether that's changing passwords, whether that's doing an audit on the system to see if they were, if you yourself were hacked. Because sometimes you'll hear that and it affects some people and there's so many complicated, aspects to what a breach means. And then every state is different on what that means too, right? But at the end of the day, if your information is compromised, no matter if it's one person or 2 million people, you should be aware of it, and you should most certainly take precautions to make sure that you can stop as much damage as possible if there's any there. So that third-party vendors, it's a scary thing. A lot of these places are small mom and pop shops. They're also much like us, are trying to save as much money and be effective as well. So we're I don't think anybody's maliciously trying to to do things that are a bit gooey or whatever you want to do on that.
Yeah.
But I think we're all human, and I think people try their best, and something happens. And unfortunately, we have in cybersecurity, we have a whole group of cyber actors that are bad, that are looking for those gaps and those weaknesses, and ready to take advantage of it. So I think most people in general, when this kind of thing happens, and a lot of local governments, and I mean, Kelly, you would definitely know this from your background. I mean, a lot of times they are completely supported by all the vendors, these kind of piecemeal, of somebody here, somebody there, figuring out. And local governments don't typically start from scratch and have their own systems. They're typically using other systems, correct?
Right. Especially, just looking for the the expertise and the outside assistance that's needed in local government. There is a great deal of reliance on outside vendors.
Yeah. And that's not necessarily bad, right? I mean, local governments are not doing it wrong. I think
not at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're wanting to do is just make sure that local governments know that that's a weak point, and that they are just doing their due diligence and just asking questions and just having good contacts, and just hopefully your vendors are good and they get you information quickly, and you're not finding out from the press, which is definitely the worst way to find out things. So,
you give an example of a question or two that they should be asking?
Absolutely. So I would definitely ask if they have a cyber incident response plan, like what is their communication tree to you if something happens, and make sure that you're comfortable with that, right? Like if they're like, well, if it comes to, if it's taking down our whole system, we'll let you know. But if it's just information that's being taken, then, it depends on how many. I think it's very fair to you say, listen, if one person, because that's a taxpayer, if any information is breached, I need to know. We're lucky to be in a state that, the privacy of people's information is taken very seriously, right? I mean, if we have privacy breaches in Indiana, you're required to report it to the Attorney General's office. So if, and a lot of people have the misconception that that doesn't include governments, local governments, or even the state, but actually that law is 100% inclusive of local governments in the state. So if a local government has a security of private information brief, they're required to meet those privacy requirements and report it to Attorney General, and then go through the specific steps within 30 days, I believe, or X amount of days to get information out. So, I think people think, well, it's government, they're all kind of, they can get away with that. But, I think if not, we are more required and should be more required than anyone else, because, we are here to serve the people and protect the people's information and operations and services. So I think asking them what their communication plan is, asking them what their what kind of, National Institute Standards technology is, basically the level of just basic standards in technology field. So I would ask them, what are your best practices? Are you following best cybersecurity practices for your national standards in technology, right? You don't necessarily have to remember all that. If you say the national best practices for technology, are you following those? And they have very specific publications of best practices for cybersecurity and notification and incident response. And so if your vendor doesn't know what that is, that probably is a good red flag, right? If they don't have a cyber incident response plan for a breach, that's a huge red flag. Because anybody who's in the tech field that doesn't have that, I would probably reconsider them as a vendor. So.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. It reminds me a little bit about, you think about cyber and IT, and I think it's a great question, Kelly. Like, what would you even ask? Something happens, how do you deal with it? And I think, man, I'm not the expert. I don't know the technical question to ask. I think it's like, you have anybody over at a contractor, say at your house to do something, and I'm not particularly handy, but to install something, a new water heater or something, and I don't know the right water heater questions, but can at least know, as Shatri said, like, what are some best practices, or how do you follow the national standard? At least kind of be able to ask some intelligent questions to get to the answer without being, we're not saying everybody has to be the cyber expert. It's just kind of knowing where to go in those questions.
Absolutely. And I think, Mark, that is such a key component with cybersecurity for anyone and everyone listening. You do not have to be, nor should you be, an expert. That's why you're dealing with contracts, right? That's why you're asking for expertise. And, again, my heart goes to local governments and government officials, because we're already strapped, right? We're typically wearing 3-4 hats. I think you just need to ask the business questions. That's really all it comes down to. And that is what we know, right? We know how to run an office. We know how to run our operations side of things. So just like you said, a contractor coming in, you would ask them, what are your qualifications? What happens if something goes wrong? And your qualifications are based on what? That's it. That would go for, like you said, water heater. That'd go for, electrician, and that should most certainly go with your technology and your cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that was pretty fantastic, Kelly, but I think I've got you topped. So my story, you ready? It's called Tales from the Encrypt.
Oh boy, can't wait.
Fun. All right, so what's the scariest place you both can think of?
Being on this podcast with you.
Okay. Besides that, so we picture long, narrow hallways, white rooms, people with needles.
Oh, hospitals are so scary.
Hospitals are super scary, right? So
yeah, they're scary on a regular day.
Exactly. Exactly.
So
yep. So I've got this good story about a hospital, which is already super scary, right? So it's a cold, dark night in January. The poor, unsuspecting people running Hancock Regional Hospital are snuggled warm in their beds. They don't know the terror that's about to descend upon them. Suddenly, an unknown group of sophisticated criminals launch an attack, but not with guns and not on the hospital itself, on the property. They attack a server in a remote emergency IT backup facility located miles away from the hospital and utilized as a complete backup. And the criminals use an electronic connection from the backup site to the main server farm and encrypt the hospital system. See Tales from the encrypt the hospital system using ransomware.
Well, wait, most ransomware attacks are started randomly, right? So the bad guys send out phishing emails all over, and they wait for any user to click the link, which initiates the download of ransomware.
That's right. That's exactly right. So yeah, they're just kind of casting that wide net and hoping, I think, that most people do it. But this was a premeditated, targeted attack. I have it from the source on Hancock Regional Hospital. So the bad guys actually used a hacked login ID and password from an outside vendor to gain entrance into the system.
You're just copying my story.
No, this is totally original. This is a totally original story. I think it's even scarier because, like, in yours, I mean, that could get very scary because it happened like what, a couple weeks ago, but in this actually happened, and the breach, the hacked login ID and password from the vendor actually got used to, you know, it's all the gore. Like mine is all the bloody and gore. The vendor came in and weaponized, the bad guys used the vendor ID and installed the ransomware, and then things got crazy, spooky.
I wish I could say you were being dramatic, but that's as simple as it can get. It is scary. I think hospitals, for me at least, you know, when you think about critical infrastructures, people think of roads, they think of electricity, they think of utilities. And we forget that sometimes that the hospital's healthcare system is considered a critical infrastructure because it absolutely is a backbone of our life and support, right? So now you add a pandemic to it, right? Now you add flu season. Now you add, you know, any bad day that's happening, an ice storm that, you know, takes down electricity, right? So it's not even, you know, around those things. And then it's a matter of, before, even like 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the number one thing people were worried about was stealing your information, right? Identity theft, right? And at this point, you know, it's interesting when I talk to critical infrastructures like hospitals, utilities, they absolutely care about your information, but that is not what keeps them up at night. What keeps them up at night is attacking the operations, is shutting down things. And then literally holding it ransom, right? So hospital systems, and we've had this happen across the board. The VA hospital got hacked, ransomware, not the one in Indiana, one in another state. And they basically had control over devices. So you look at hospitals nowadays, you go to, loved one goes in there, it's already scary. Unfortunately, because of the way things are now, they're typically alone or only have one person there, depending on the hospital and the size, right? You have overworked nurses, you have short staff, you have, you know, a nurse can oversee 15 patients because everything's electronic, right? They can literally see their bed vitals all on a tablet now. So they are strapped. If anything goes down, now you're now considering the operations side of one nurse or even two nurses can't go and check everybody at the same time. So what if somebody crashes? What if somebody starts getting very sick, or they take a control over their, you know, medicine drips and so on? And that absolutely has happened. So that is why, you know, especially when it comes down to the ransomware, you know, they are saying, we'll give you the keys to this. We've locked it up for you. We'll give you the keys to this, but you have to pay us money.
Should people explain ransomware a little more? Like, what is that term?
So basically, it's somebody who takes over your computer system or your smart devices that are connected to a computer system, right? And then they lock it up. The bad actor locks it up, and they hold the keys in front of you and say, "Hey, you've been ransomed. You need to pay us $50,000, or we're not going to give you back the keys. And by the way, when I give you back the keys, everything will be there, but it'll all be scrambled up." And what's even crazier about ransomware and these cyber attacks is they will even have the audacity, because it's a business model. It isn't just for fun. Like, this is how they make their money. They will even say, here are three to five people that we've ransomed. So we really mean it when we say we'll give it back to you because they paid and we gave them their keys back. So they literally are telling you, you can go check our references. And I know, right? And when I heard that a few years ago, I was like, okay, I can kind of see that though, because what's the number one question? Well, what if they don't give it back to us? We're like, no, we will give it back to you. So here are 5 other people that we ransomed and they gave back. So it really becomes this ridiculous, crazy nightmare of a business model that now has just ruined your organization and puts people's lives at little risk, right? So how do you respond to that as a hospital CEO? How do you respond to that as a CIO? It's no longer just about information. It's about saving people's lives. And what CEO or hospital CIO is going to say, or board going to say, just, you know, a lot of times they'll say, pay the ransom. Now, FBI enforcement will say, you shouldn't, just like when people kidnap kids, right? They're like, don't pay the ransom, because if you do that, you set a precedent and you get put on a list and you can cause more problems. But just like with a kid, how many people actually still do? A lot of people, because you're like, I can't put a price. And the same thing with hospitals. They're in such a really hard position to be in, because what's going to be the headline for the hospital? Is it going to be they were ransomed and they didn't pay, and that person's life was worth the $50,000 they didn't pay, when, you know, people already have a misconception of how much hospitals make, even though they're typically just trying to get by themselves? Or is it going to be that they paid? And so they really are in a no-win situation, right? So it's a tough one, and it's scary. It is, I would say, healthcare, hospitals, where it has a direct line into our livelihood, it has direct line to safety and health. I would say that does give me nightmares, and I'm pretty certain any CIO, CEO, or even person who works at a hospital or goes to a hospital is always going to have that in the back of their mind, that when they're connected to something that's smart, that's all controlled from a tablet, then you're vulnerable, and it's a tough one.
Sure. You're giving me chills. I have to say, I am familiar with that story, Tales from the Encrypt. Is that right, Mark?
Of course.
But Steve Long, who's CEO of Hancock Regional Hospital, he is just out front telling this story because he's a big believer that by sharing his story, others can learn. And so I'll tell our listening on the ending of the story. You conveniently left off, Mark. Hancock resolved the ransomware. They continued to operate over the 4 days while dealing with this. So scary middle, but happy ending.
And I have to give props to Hancock County because, and Steve Long has presented to the governor's Indiana Executive Council on Cybersecurity, because you're right, he is upfront, and there is something about leadership who owns it and then uses that as a case study and warns others and say, it happened to me. I mean, the fact that people wake up and they're like, Hancock County, you may think Marion County, or you may think Riley or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But a county hospital, that's most certainly within the purview of local government, right? So that's the scary part. And Steve, he is out there most certainly, and they are wanting to help people bring it to, he always thought cybersecurity was important at the beginning, but the fact that it affected him in such an operational way, and it changed his perspective on how much more cybersecurity is important, I think is a tell that every CEO of every hospital should consider. Because it did affect him operations. What he thought, maybe been ones and zeros, right, was actually very much bedside of patients, or, nurses, resources to nurses and doctors so they can do their job and save lives. I think it is a scary story, but to your point, Kelly, it gratefully had a very good ending, but all it could have done was an extra day or an extra attack, or a true everything for them to have to go through the horrible consideration of, if a hospital goes down, now they have to consider moving patients and the kind of risks that go with that, right? So it most certainly is something to be leery about, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're pointing out the value of the CEO being out in front and leading, in teaching others about what happened. I think that lends a real credibility and spotlight to the issue. Shatrice, I think it's your turn to tell a scary.
My turn to tell a scary story. Oh, but I have so many.
You and I were talking yesterday as we kind of prepared for this. So you're talking about one of the scariest movies you've ever seen that you just watched over the weekend.
Oh my goodness, yes. I think when it comes down to cybersecurity, we've been talking about how it affects like local government, or how it affects a hospital. And those are like big ideas, right? Those are like, for somebody like me at home, or somebody like you who's listening or watching at home, you're like, okay, but that's a CEO's problem to consider, or a commissioner should maybe go and ask their county hospital, hey, do you have a cyber incident response plan? Because I don't want that call, right? Or whatever the case may be. But I think, as we've been discussing over the last couple of things, it also becomes a very individual thing, right? What can we do to protect ourselves, our families? So let's take it all back home, right? Just like back to like I can't control my kids going to their houses, maybe what they're doing inside, or me going, maybe going to Meijer and getting, like, if Meijer gets hacked, but I can't control what happens in my house, right? So yes, one of the scariest movies that I've seen lately has been The Social Dilemma. Mm-hmm. Now, if you've heard it, it's on Netflix, and since like a majority of people have Netflix, especially during COVID, because what else can we do, right? But it is something worth watching if you want to, one, really consider the impact of social media on your lives. And not from a sense of, now, of course, you have people in there that are like, you should all get rid of social media. But you're having people who, like the guy who created the like button on Facebook, like, CEOs of the boards for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. The guy who was a co-creator of Pinterest. And, I love pinning as much as everybody, right? Mm-hmm. So, when you're looking and talking to these people who are like, we really thought we were doing something good. We knew there were risks, but you're looking at, a group of people in Silicon Valley trying to psychologically figure out what's going to keep you on the longest, because it's really about monetizing it as well, right? And we've heard a lot about that over the last couple of years with the Cambridge study, or analytics attack, and Facebook going in front of Congress and Twitter and so on. And it's one of those things I think people are like, yeah, I probably should. Maybe, people have deleted it, or people will say, well, I'll pay attention to it. But I think it's much like when you're online and you're really considering what you're sharing, know two things. One, there's no such thing, even behind a locked account, private account, that everything you're doing is being tracked. So even, and I know this is crazy, Snapchat, when it goes away, and I put this in big parentheses, and so many hours, it doesn't. It's backlogged, it's somewhere. So always be cognizant of what you're posting online. And even if you post it and delete it, it has been recorded somewhere. And it's not just social media, Google. I mean, the guy who invented Google Drive, right, which we use now all the time, right? It's become part of our everyday. He's on there saying, we literally had meetings about just this. How do we get people to use it? How do we make money off of it? And the information that we're sharing. So it's really become where you have oil that you do stocks in. Now you have information, right? And it's our change of behavior. Now, I to the credit of the people who were in that, they really do talk a lot about, they didn't expect, if they would have seen it very bit differently, nobody expected the kind of turn of how social media is being used for, misinformation about elections and democracies. But these are the unintended consequences of such a powerful platform, right? And once the genies come out, you can't really, or I guess ghost in this case, can't really put it back in. So I would highly suggest it. I think it is worth watching it if you're a parent, if you're a person who uses social media, a person who Googles. I Google everything. Like between Siri and Google, I imagine anybody in the back end using that information, sharing that information, knows a lot more about me that I probably remember. So I think it's important just to be cognizant of what information you're sharing, and just know that if Google has it, if Facebook has it, if Twitter has it, if anybody else has it, then any bad actor can get it too. And I think that's something to consider when you're looking at keeping yourself safe, your family safe, and your kids safe. Just like we want to try to keep our kids safe even around these Halloween times. So.
Well, that is really scary.
Yes.
It really is. We're all vulnerable.
And
we really are.
Shatrice, like, it's not going away, right? Like, certainly we could all drop social media. But even like from a personal standpoint, we could drop social media, but our businesses, our local governments, organizations, it's a direct way to communicate with a lot of our constituencies, our folks like that. So
absolutely.
I think different way to do it. Like,
yeah. Be safe about it. Pay attention to, take locations off. Don't share. Now I know that with the latest update with Apple, for example, you can select photos that you share with a platform instead of sharing your whole roll of photos, right? Use that function. Does it take an extra minute? Yes, it does. But is that worth it? Do you really want Facebook to have every single photo? And I mean every single photo you've ever taken of everything? Is that something to consider? Or does Twitter really need to know where you're at the entire time? Or should you just take off your location services? So go through your settings, and make sure the people who have access to your phone, to your mic, to your video, to your location really needs to have that, right? I have several apps that will say, we want to have your location access. And I'm like, that app does not need my location. Turn off notifications. That's the way that they, from a social media perspective, it is about getting you to behave in a way that they want, which is select their type of, select their app, use their app, advertisers use that, and that's what they do, right? So you choose when to go to that notification. Don't just get drawn to it every single time they over notify you. That's the behavior they're looking for. And I didn't think of that. That's one of the things they talk about in that documentary is the power behind notifications, the behavior and psychological component as a human, our need to if we see we're tagged on a picture, we need to see what that is. And really, but is that really dominating your life more than you think? Look at your screen time, limit your screen time with your kids. And I know that makes me super unpopular with my kids, but there is no reason why they should have their phones in their room at night, right? I usually liken it to, well, let's take Halloween, for example. Would you let your kid walk around on a scary night at 1 a.m. in the morning with all these crazy people and dangers and so on? No, you wouldn't. So that is no different from letting them walk around online with as many, if not way more, creepers and dangerous people at 1 a.m. in the morning online, right? Who are counting on the fact that parents are letting them be online, right? So I think it's important to just protect yourself. And you're absolutely right, Mark. I mean, I have 4 kids. I get information out for my job. I'm on social media. I'm not going to delete social media, but it's very much like wine. I love wine. I drink wine, but I don't drink it every day, all day long. I drink it responsibly. I don't go drive a car. I don't, do that. So we can have these things in our life, and if we put the right parameters around it and we use it in a healthy way, I think it's fine across the board. And I do believe that's the same way with social media. We don't need to go crazy on one side or another side of deleting it or overusing it and being bombarded by it. I think it's important for us to find that happy medium with ourselves and with our kids. Soapbox done. Now that everybody's fully scared about everything they're typing into Google.
This has been a great time around the campfire. This has been great idea, Kelly, to do these scary campfire stories, because they are scary, but I think we've learned some things too that kind of help us along.
I agree. I mean, we can't just fall into a hole and avoid, all the electronic technology and social media. We still need to communicate that way. And but I love that you're raising our awareness, Shatrice. I appreciate especially the tip on location app, access, the things that we could go look at. You really don't need access to this, and you don't need access to this, so that we're still getting the benefits of the technology, but we're not giving away every last bit of information about ourselves. At least we hope not. And just remembering that, once it's out there, it's out there. If you put some information, a photo, whatever out, it just doesn't go away.
Yep, absolutely, Kelly.
So thank you for all of that.
Yeah,
happy to do so.
I was gonna say if like the ghost said, if nobody here objects, do a little quick bond bank pitch. That one thing that communities can do. We've talked a lot about the way you use the technology and software and vulnerabilities, but one of the things you can do is continue to keep that older technology updated, the hardware, whether it's computers for schools, servers, other infrastructures. Keep your outdated equipment up to date. And the bond bank has a program that actually gives you a great legal advantage to be able to do that, where you can competitively bid the equipment, skip some steps in the process legally. This is actually not a very scary thing. This is a great one-page application, easy to use program to bid the equipment financing for any kind of equipment, not just computers. But we have a little blurb here to tell you a little bit more about that program. Well, thank you for taking a second there to listen to our Bond Bank Help commercial. Again, great campfire time. I don't know if Shatrice, Kelly, you have anything to add?
Be safe out there, in person and online.
Jace, will you join us again next time?
Yeah, I'd love that. Maybe
Well,
I'll even bring somebody with me.
Fun. Well, like the mummy says, that's a wrap for episode 3 of Days of Our Cyber Lives podcast. I had to. If you enjoyed our corny jokes and learning about cybersecurity, really learning from Shatrice, from Kelly's experience in local government, and tolerating me, hopefully you've enjoyed the conversation. If you have topics you'd like to suggest, certainly shoot any of us a note. We'd be happy to talk about that. And again, there's just a wealth, I think just a trove of things to talk about. So yeah, I would love to continue the Days of Our Cyber Lives series. And Shatrice, see you again. Listeners, click subscribe to the Indiana Bondcast, wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts. And for the Indiana Bond Bank, this is Mark Woolner.
Treasurer of State's office. This is Treasurer Kelly Mitchell signing off and saying thank you for tuning in to Days of Our Cyber Lives on the Indiana Bondcast.